At 1:47 p.m. on December 7, 1941, the telephone on the president's desk screamed with a sound that would end the American century of isolation. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox was on the line, and he didn't offer a greeting. He delivered a sentence that physically staggered the most powerful man in the world. "Mr. President, it looks like the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." In that single second, the concept of peace evaporated. There was no preamble. There was no diplomatic cushion. There was only the raw, grinding reality that the United States Navy, the shield of the Republic, was being turned into scrap metal thousands of miles away. Roosevelt didn't ask how. He didn't ask why. He knew. While his aide, Harry Hopkins, desperately tried to argue that it must be a mistake, a localized accident, perhaps a rogue pilot, Roosevelt cut him off with a terrifying coldness. "It is true," he said. He knew the Japanese military capability better than his advisors gave them credit for. He knew that if they struck to kill. The report wasn't a warning. It was an obituary for the Pacific Fleet. Within minutes, the Oval Study transformed from a place of leisure into the nerve center of a global catastrophe. The phone rang again. Admiral Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, confirmed the nightmare. The attack was not a raid. It was a slaughter. The USS Arizona was gone. The Oklahoma was capsized. The West Virginia was sinking. Men were burning in the oil-slicked waters of the harbor. Roosevelt, a man who loved the Navy more than any other institution on earth, listened as his life's passion was dismantled, ship by ship. This wasn't just a political crisis, it was a personal evisceration. But as the color drained from his face, a harder, darker resolve took its place. He wasn't just the commander-in-chief anymore. He was a man staring into the abyss of total war. Before we reveal the secret words he spoke to his cabinet that night, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. The minutes following the initial call were not filled with organized responses, but with a chaotic blizzard of contradictory intelligence that threatened to paralyze the White House. Reports flooded in, each more hysterical than the last. One dispatch claimed the Japanese were landing troops on Oahu. Another claimed the Panama Canal had been bombed. A third reported Japanese carriers off the coast of San Francisco. The fog of war had descended instantly, thick and suffocating. Roosevelt sat in the center of this hurricane, his cigarette holder clenched between his teeth, forcing himself to separate fact from panic. He knew that reacting to false information could leave the mainland defenseless. If he moved the Atlantic Fleet to the Pacific, he left the East Coast open to Hitler. If he kept them there, the West Coast might burn. The stakes were not just about losing ships. They were about losing the sovereign integrity of the United States. At 2:05 p.m., he called Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State. Hull was scheduled to meet with the Japanese ambassadors, Nomura and Kurusu, at that very moment. Roosevelt's instructions were brutal and precise. He told Hull to receive them, but to look them in the eye and dismiss them with the coldest anger he could muster. He was not to tell them about the attack. Roosevelt wanted the Japanese diplomats to stand there, unknowingly representing a government that had just committed the greatest treachery in modern history. He wanted Hull to see if they showed any sign of knowledge, any flicker of guilt. It was a psychological test amidst the carnage. Meanwhile, the phone kept ringing. The death toll was rising by the hundreds every time he picked it up. The president wasn't just managing a war. He was managing the collapse of the American psychological defense. The ocean, which had protected the country for 150 years, had suddenly become a highway for enemies. Harry Hopkins, usually the president's sharpest mind, was struggling to comprehend the scale of the betrayal. He paced the room, insisting that the Japanese wouldn't dare provoke the industrial might of the United States. It was suicide, he argued. But Roosevelt understood something Hopkins didn't. Desperation makes nations dangerous. He realized that Japan wasn't trying to win a long war. They were trying to knock America out before the fight even started. This realization chilled him more than the attack itself, because it meant the enemy was rational, calculated, and utterly ruthless. At 2:28 p.m., Admiral Stark called again. The news got worse. The Army Air Corps on Oahu had been caught on the ground. Wingtip to wingtip, the planes had been lined up to prevent sabotage, making them perfect targets for Japanese bombers. They were burning on the tarmac. The United States had virtually no air power left in Hawaii. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. If the carriers were also caught, and nobody knew where the carriers were, the war might be over before it began. Roosevelt's physical disability, usually a background fact of his presidency, suddenly became a focal point of tension in the room. He couldn't pace. He couldn't run to the map room. He was trapped in his chair, forced to process the destruction of his country entirely within his own mind. His paralysis became a metaphor for the nation, struck down, unable to move, vulnerable. Yet those who were in the room later reported that, while his legs were useless, his mind was operating at a velocity that frightened them. He began barking orders, bypassing the chain of command, reaching out directly to commanders. He wasn't waiting for confirmation anymore. He was assuming the worst-case scenario, invasion. At 2:50 p.m., the phone rang with a different tone. It was a transatlantic call from London. Winston Churchill was on the line. For 2 years, Churchill had been begging, pleading, and maneuvering to get the United States into the war against Hitler. He had watched London burn during the Blitz, hoping for American salvation. Now, hearing the news of the attack, his voice wasn't somber. It was practically vibrating with energy. "Mr. President," Churchill shouted, "what's this about Japan?" Roosevelt didn't sugarcoat it. "They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now." Those words changed the trajectory of human history. For Churchill, the attack was a horrific salvation. He knew instantly what it meant. Britain would not fall. With American industrial power fully unleashed, the Axis powers were doomed. It might take years and millions of lives, but the outcome was now certain. Roosevelt knew this too, but his perspective was darker. He wasn't celebrating a strategic alliance. He was mourning the end of American innocence. He told Churchill that he would go to Congress the next day. He didn't know yet if he would declare war on Germany, only Japan. This was a critical tactical ambiguity. Roosevelt feared that if he declared war on Hitler without Hitler attacking first, the American public might balk. He had to focus the nation's rage on the immediate attacker. Churchill understood. He promised to declare war on Japan immediately, within the hour, to show solidarity. The two leaders, separated by an ocean but united by catastrophe, briefly shared the weight of the world. But when Roosevelt hung up, the relief of alliance faded, replaced by the crushing reality of the casualty reports still streaming in from Hawaii. By 8:30 p.m., the cabinet members began to arrive at the White House. The mood in the hallway was funereal. These were men who had spent years trying to keep America out of the conflict, or at least preparing for it on their own terms. Now, they walked into the Oval Study to find a president who looked physically transformed. Roosevelt was usually the center of buoyancy, a man of infectious optimism. Tonight he was grim, his face set in lines of granite. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fear. They gathered in a semicircle around his desk. Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins later wrote that Roosevelt had a terrible calmness about him. He didn't shout. He didn't pound the table. He spoke in a low, steady voice that commanded absolute silence. "It's the most serious cabinet session since Lincoln met with the cabinet at the outbreak of the Civil War," he told them. He wanted them to understand the historical magnitude of the moment. This wasn't a diplomatic skirmish. This was the beginning of a struggle for survival. He began to read the reports aloud. As he listed the ships, Arizona, Oklahoma, Nevada, the cabinet members gasped. They had expected damage. They had not expected annihilation. The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, looked as if he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The realization spread through the room that the United States was currently defenseless in the Pacific. If the Japanese fleet decided to keep sailing east, there was nothing to stop them from shelling San Francisco or Los Angeles. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the scratch of Roosevelt's pen as he made notes on the next batch of telegrams. What Roosevelt told the public, and even what he told Congress the next day, was a sanitized version of the truth. But in that room, at that hour, he laid out the full, horrifying scope of the disaster. He revealed that the Pacific Fleet had not just been damaged, it had been smashed. Over 2,000 sailors were dead. The airfields were graveyards of twisted metal. The defenses of the island were practically non-existent. He admitted that they didn't know where the Japanese carriers were. This admission of blindness was the most terrifying part. The commander-in-chief had to look his cabinet in the eye and say, "I don't know where the enemy is." He warned them that this might be part of a coordinated global offensive. He expected hit-and-run attacks on the West Coast. He anticipated sabotage in defense plants. He told the Attorney General to prepare emergency measures to detain potential spies. The Constitution, he implied, would have to bend to accommodate the reality of total war. He also shared a piece of intelligence that made the betrayal burn even hotter. The attack had commenced while Japanese diplomats were still sitting in the waiting room of the State Department. The duplicity was absolute. Roosevelt used this to harden the resolve of the men in the room. There would be no negotiations. There would be no truce. The objective was now unconditional surrender. He was marshaling his team not just for a military campaign, but for a moral crusade. He needed them to feel the rage he felt, to burn away their hesitation. Shortly after the cabinet briefing, the congressional leaders arrived. This was a much more volatile group. Isolationists, political rivals, men who had spent the last decade fighting every attempt Roosevelt made to expand the military. They filed into the Oval Study with skepticism written on their faces. They had heard rumors, but they wanted proof. Roosevelt didn't offer them arguments. He offered them the casualty list. When he read the numbers, the room went dead silent. Senator Tom Connally, a Democrat from Texas, exploded. He jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage. "How did it happen?" he bellowed. "Where was the Navy? Were they asleep? How could they be caught like sitting ducks?" It was the question that would haunt the administration for years. Roosevelt didn't fight back. He didn't make excuses. He simply lowered his head and said, "We don't know yet." He let their anger wash over him. He knew they needed to vent. He knew they were terrified. By absorbing their rage, he was unifying them. He turned to the Republicans, the men who had called him a warmonger, and asked for their support. He told them he would appear before a joint session the next day. He wasn't asking for a declaration of war yet. He was telling them he would ask for it. The political maneuvering was over. The partisan bickering that had defined the 1930s died in that room. When the meeting broke up, men who hadn't spoken civilly to each other in years walked out shaking hands, united by a common enemy and a shared sense of vulnerability. As night fell over Washington, a new, visceral fear gripped the Secret Service. The Capitol was completely illuminated. The White House shone like a beacon in the dark. If the Japanese could strike Hawaii, could they launch planes from submarines off the Atlantic coast? Could German saboteurs be waiting in the bushes? The Secret Service ordered an immediate blackout. For the first time in decades, the White House went dark. Agents swarmed the grounds with submachine guns. They demanded that the president move to a secure bunker. Roosevelt refused. He absolutely refused to hide in the basement of his own house. He wanted to be in his study, surrounded by his familiar things, maintaining a semblance of control. A compromise was reached. Heavy black curtains were nailed over the windows of the Oval Study. The hammering echoed through the halls, a stark reminder that the war had come to Pennsylvania Avenue. Inside the darkened room, the atmosphere was claustrophobic. The air was stale, recycled and thick with smoke. Outside, crowds were beginning to gather at the gates, singing, "God Bless America," and peering through the iron fence, looking for reassurance. Inside, Roosevelt sat in a pool of lamplight, acutely aware that he was a sitting target. Every plane engine heard overhead caused a moment of frozen tension. The Secret Service doubled the guard, then tripled it. They set up machine gun nests on the roof. The transition from presidency to military command post was physical, immediate, and terrifying. While Washington hunkered down, the West Coast was on the verge of mass hysteria. Reports were coming into the White House switchboard that were pure hallucinations born of terror. People reported seeing Japanese squadrons over Los Angeles. Fishermen claimed to see periscopes off the coast of Oregon. The governor of California was demanding anti-aircraft guns that didn't exist. Roosevelt had to manage this panic while knowing that, technically, an attack was possible. He consulted with General Marshall. They had to make a brutal calculation. If they sent the few remaining interceptor planes to California, they stripped the East Coast and the Panama Canal. Roosevelt had to gamble. He decided to hold the reserves. He had to trust that the Japanese strike force had turned back toward Tokyo to refuel. It was a strategic bet made with the lives of millions of civilians as the chips. He ordered a news blackout on the movement of ships. He didn't want the Japanese to know what was left. This silence, however, fueled the panic on the coast. Civilians felt abandoned. They felt that Washington was sacrificing them. Roosevelt knew this, but he maintained the silence. He understood that information was now a weapon, and he couldn't afford to give the enemy any targeting data. He sat by the radio, listening to the reports of blackouts in San Francisco and Seattle, knowing that if he was wrong, the blood would be on his hands. In the midst of the geopolitical storm, Eleanor Roosevelt fought her own battle. She had been scheduled to do a radio broadcast that evening. Her advisors told her to cancel it. Roosevelt told her to do it. He knew the country needed a mother figure, as much as they needed a commander. But before she went on air, she saw her husband in a rare moment of vulnerability. She later wrote that he seemed deadly calm, but beneath it, she saw the profound sadness of a man who had spent his life trying to build a peaceful world, only to see it shattered. Eleanor had sons of military age: James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. She knew, with the certainty of a mother, that this war would claim them. They would go. They would fight. They might die. When she looked at Franklin, she didn't just see the president. She saw the father who was about to sign the orders that would send their children into the line of fire. The unspoken tension between them was heavy with this personal sacrifice. She went to the microphone and delivered a speech that was raw and unpolished. She spoke to the women of America. She told them that they had a job to do, that the war would be fought in the kitchens and factories as much as on the battlefield. It was the first time the American public heard a voice from the White House that night, and it wasn't the president's. It was Eleanor's. She bridged the gap between the cold statistics of the cabinet room and the terrified living rooms of the nation. Back in the Oval Study, Franklin listened, knowing that she was preparing the country for the long, dark years ahead. Around midnight, the chaos began to settle into a grim rhythm. It was time to write the speech. Roosevelt's advisors, including Hull, wanted a long, detailed address. They wanted a legal indictment of Japanese aggression, a history lesson listing every treaty violated, every diplomatic insult. They drafted a 30-page document that read like a lawyer's brief. It was accurate, comprehensive, and utterly boring. Roosevelt rejected it. He pushed the papers aside and called for his secretary, Grace Tully. He understood the new medium of radio better than anyone. He knew that the American people were in shock. They couldn't process a history lesson. They needed a battle cry. They needed clarity. He wanted a speech that was short, punchy, and violent in its simplicity. He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and began to dictate. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. He paused. He tested the rhythm. He wanted the date to be burned into the collective memory. He dictated the first draft in minutes. It was less than 500 words. His advisors were horrified. They thought it was too short, too simplistic. They argued that it didn't explain the context. Roosevelt ignored them. He wasn't speaking to historians. He was speaking to the angry mechanic in Detroit and the frightened farmer in Iowa. He was crafting a verbal weapon. The draft sat on his desk, a mess of scratches and arrows. He read the first line over and over. A date which will live in world history. It was passive. It was academic. World history was a textbook term. It didn't capture the betrayal. It didn't capture the evil. He picked up his pen and scratched out world history. In his bold, sprawling hand, he wrote a single word above it. Infamy. A date which will live in infamy. The word changed everything. Infamy wasn't just fame. It was wicked fame. It implied a moral stain that would last forever. It framed the Japanese not just as enemies, but as villains. With that one edit, Roosevelt defined the narrative of the war. It wasn't a war over territory or resources. It was a war between civilization and treachery. He continued to edit, sharpening the sentences. He listed the locations attacked: Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, Philippine Islands, Wake Island, Midway Island. The repetition was intentional. It created a drumbeat of aggression. Bang, bang, bang. It showed the coordinated nature of the assault. By the time he was finished, the speech was a sledgehammer. It left no room for doubt, no room for negotiation. It was a declaration of total intent. He went to bed with the draft on his nightstand, the word infamy, waiting to be unleashed on the world. While Roosevelt edited his speech, a final piece of the diplomatic puzzle clicked into place, sealing the moral fate of Japan. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Japanese notification breaking off negotiations was intended to be delivered at 1 p.m. Washington time, 20 minutes before the bombs fell. It was meant to be a technicality, a way for Japan to claim they had followed the rules of war. But the Japanese embassy had bungled the decoding. The typists were slow. The ambassadors, flustered and incompetent, arrived late. They delivered the message after the attack had already started. Roosevelt seized on this. Even if they had delivered it on time, he noted, it wasn't a declaration of war. It was just a breaking off of talks. But the delay made it look like supreme cowardice. Roosevelt knew he could use this. He would paint the Japanese not just as aggressors, but as deceitful liars who smiled while holding a dagger. This was crucial for unifying the country. Americans might debate policy, but they hated a cheater. They hated a sucker punch. Roosevelt decided to highlight this timing discrepancy in his speech. He would make sure the world knew that the United States had been talking peace while Japan plotted murder. It was the final nail in the coffin of isolationism. Roosevelt was wheeled into his bedroom in the early hours of the morning, but sleep was impossible. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the crisis began to fade, replaced by the chronic pain that was his constant companion. His sinus condition flared up. His legs ached. He lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the frantic capital outside. He knew that by morning, the initial shock would turn to anger, and then to questions. Why was the fleet there? Why were they surprised? The blame game would begin. He had to get ahead of it. He lay there, rehearsing the speech, testing the cadence of the words in the dark. He thought about the casualties. The numbers were still rising. 403 dead. He knew many of the officers personally. This was the burden of the commander-in-chief, to send men to die, and then to use their deaths as political capital to send more. He also thought about the future. He knew, with a strategist's foresight, that the war would be long. He knew Germany would declare war soon. He was looking at a two-front war, fighting across two oceans, with a military that was currently ranked 18th in the world, behind Romania. The task was impossible. The logistical challenge was insurmountable. But as he lay there, a strange calm settled over him. The waiting was over. The ambiguity was gone. The fight was here. December 8th broke cold and gray. The newspapers hit the streets with headlines that screamed in fonts usually reserved for the second coming. Japs bomb Hawaii. War. The newsboys didn't have to shout. The papers sold out in seconds. Across the country, the reality set in. Recruiting stations were already seeing lines wrap around the block. Young men, fueled by the radio reports of the night before, were clamoring for revenge. In the White House, the mood was grimly professional. The time for shock had passed. Now it was time for procedure. Roosevelt met with his military advisors one last time. The damage assessment was complete. It was catastrophic, but not fatal. The fuel reserves at Pearl Harbor had been missed. The dry docks were intact. And most importantly, the aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, the Saratoga, were at sea. They had survived. Roosevelt grasped this lifeline. The carriers were the future. The battleships were the past. The Japanese had destroyed the past, but they had missed the future. He breathed a sigh of relief. He had a fighting chance. He adjusted his braces, locked his knees, and prepared to face the Congress. The speech was typed. The car was waiting. The world was holding its breath. At 12 p.m. on December 8th, the presidential motorcade departed the White House. The drive to the Capitol is usually a ceremonial procession, but today it was a gauntlet. The Secret Service was in a state of near panic. They were convinced that if Japanese bombers could hit Hawaii, German assassins could hit Pennsylvania Avenue. Agents rode on the running boards of the limousine, submachine guns openly displayed, scanning the rooftops for sniper scopes. The streets were lined with thousands of silent Americans. There was no cheering. There were no waves. The mood was described by observers as a, quote, grim determination. Roosevelt sat in the back, wearing a Navy cape, his face set in stone. He knew that his physical vulnerability was the nation's greatest liability. If he were killed now, the country would collapse into chaos. He gripped the door handle, his knuckles white, not from fear, but from the sheer physical effort of holding himself upright against the swaying of the car. As they approached the Capitol, the security cordon was unprecedented. Marines with fixed bayonets surrounded the building. The fear of a decapitation strike, killing the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court in one blow, was real. Roosevelt was wheeled to the entrance, out of sight of the crowd. Then, in the privacy of the cloakroom, he began the agonizing process of locking his leg braces. He took a deep breath, grabbed the arm of his son James, and prepared to walk. He would not enter the chamber in a wheelchair. He would stand before the people, even if it cost him every ounce of strength he had. Inside the House chamber, the air was electric. The room was packed beyond capacity. Senators, representatives, Supreme Court justices, and cabinet members were squeezed onto the floor. The gallery was overflowing. Even the press, usually cynical and detached, sat in stunned silence. When the doorkeeper announced, "The President of the United States," the room erupted, not in polite applause, but in a primal roar. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage mixed with relief. For years, this room had been a battlefield of isolationists versus interventionists. Democrats and Republicans had torn each other apart over the issue of war. But as Roosevelt swung his stiff legs forward, step by agonizing step, dragging his paralyzed body toward the podium, the political divisions evaporated. Men who had called him a dictator a week ago were now cheering him as the savior of the republic. Roosevelt reached the podium and gripped it with hands that shook slightly from exertion. He waited. He let the applause wash over him. Then he let the silence return. He opened the black binder. He didn't smile. He adjusted his glasses. The radio microphones hummed, carrying his breath to 81% of American households. He looked down at the text he had edited the night before, the word infamy staring back at him. He took a breath and began. The speech lasted only 6 minutes and 30 seconds. It was a masterpiece of brevity. Roosevelt didn't shout. He spoke with a slow, deliberate cadence that emphasized the cold fury of the nation. When he delivered the line, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, a shudder went through the room. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a verdict. He listed the locations of the attacks with the rhythm of a prosecutor reading a rap sheet. Japan has, therefore, undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. He stripped away any ambiguity. He didn't ask Congress to debate. He told them the facts. He asked for a declaration of war, not as a political choice, but as a recognition of reality. Hostilities exist, he said flatly. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. Then came the pivot. The fear of the night before was replaced by a promise of vengeance. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, he boomed, his voice finally rising. The American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. The chamber exploded. Absolute victory. Not a negotiated peace, not a truce. Total destruction of the enemy. In those 6 minutes, Roosevelt transformed a paralyzed nation into a war machine. As soon as the president left the chamber, the voting began. The Senate acted with lightning speed. The vote was 82-0. The isolationists, the men who had sworn never to send American boys to die in foreign wars, voted aye, without hesitation. The unity was absolute. In the House of Representatives, the vote took minutes. The roll call was a monotonous drumbeat of aye, aye, aye. But there was one break in the rhythm. Jeanette Rankin, a representative from Montana and a lifelong pacifist, stood up. She had voted against World War I, and she would vote against World War II. As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else, she said. Her vote was no. The reaction was visceral. Boos and hisses rained down from the gallery. Colleagues looked at her with disgust. It was 388-1. Rankin had to be escorted out of the building by police and hid in a telephone booth to escape an angry mob. Her lone dissent highlighted just how total the shift was. There was no room for conscience anymore. There was only the war. At 4:10 p.m., Roosevelt signed the declaration. The United States was officially at war. That evening, across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, reportedly sat on the deck of his flagship. While his junior officers celebrated the burning of the American fleet, Yamamoto was despondent. He had lived in America. He knew its industrial capacity. He supposedly muttered the lines that would become legend. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. He was right. Roosevelt's infamy speech didn't just declare war. It mobilized the greatest industrial expansion in human history. The factories of Detroit stopped making cars and started making tanks. The kitchens of America started rationing sugar and steel. The giant was awake, and it was angry. The decision Roosevelt made in that dark room, to reject the long history lesson and choose the word infamy, framed the war as a crusade of good against evil. The world we live in today, the American superpower, the nuclear age, the global alliances, was born in the 24 hours between that first phone call and the final signature. Roosevelt didn't just survive the night. He forged the weapon that would break empires. But the cost was just beginning. Before you go, if you want to know what Churchill said when he found out the atomic bomb was ready, click the video on your screen right now. It's a story of secrets you won't believe. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.